Chapter 6, Organizational Change, Part 1. In this chapter, we are obviously going to focus on how you actually can go about changing a department, either in small ways or in major ways, even complete overhauls. These changes can either be achieved voluntarily, that's what we hope, or they can be forced upon a police department. And so we'll talk about the different ways that change can be achieved. Mostly we're going to focus on voluntary and willing change, but then we'll talk a little bit also about how outside organizations can force change upon police departments that are unwilling to change themselves. So let's take a look at some of the things that your book identifies as ways to achieve organizational change. Obviously, reorganization is one way that you can change. This is where, as you can pretty much surmise from the name, you can take a police department and rearrange the parts, dedicate it to a whole new style of policing, maybe more of a teamwork approach to policing, get rid of the previous rank structure. Again, maybe you collapse units into each other or you create new units, but you can do that complete overhaul, that complete reorganization. The point that I have here in the PowerPoint is that these complete reorganizations rarely happen. Usually change is done in more of a slow, gradual, piecemeal fashion, and usually complete reorganization isn't done all at once. The police tend to be among the most conservative professions, and by conservative I don't necessarily mean political conservatism, but just resistance to change is what I mean. Conservative, not wanting to change, wanting to keep things as they are. And so the police are very much driven by tradition, really reluctant to change in many instances. So this isn't much different than even lawyers and courts, where we still have judges wearing robes. Why do we need to do that anymore? Well, it's tradition. So the judges wear robes. You have certain procedures and certain ceremonies that you go through in court, in essence, that if you didn't have them, you would wonder what was going on. And so the lawyers are very much tied to the past and are reluctant to change quickly. Well, similarly, the police are too. They like to have their history. If you go into a police department, you might see pictures of retired officers up on the wall. They have their ceremonies. If an officer dies, obviously there's a lot of pomp and circumstance associated with it, and a lot of tradition in those ceremonies. So it shouldn't be a surprise that if you're going to completely reorganize a police department, it's probably going to be pretty rare that happens. And what else I have here also in this first PowerPoint point is that even when the police do appear to completely reorganize, it may just be to look good. That those changes may really just be superficial. We're going to adopt a new community policing, teamwork approach to policing, and it really looks like they're doing that, but when you scratch below the surface, they're pretty much doing things the way they've always done them. So reorganization is possible, but again, it's pretty rare. Another way that you can change an organization is to improve leadership and management. Either through retirement or voluntarily leaving the position, or maybe it's a police chief who's fired. In some way or another, the old police chief has left, and now we have a new chief. So either they were forced out, or they voluntarily left through retirement or taking a job elsewhere. But one way or another, our former chief has left, and we now have a new chief. And so that can cause changes. But you can also go farther down on the management, farther down on the management list, and find even middle-level managers, changing them, either through forced change or through voluntary. Maybe they've retired, maybe they've gone on to other positions. But if either through training them better or getting different managers, you can achieve perhaps organizational change if they have different ideas than the previous managers and different methods. Revising policies and procedures. So you may have new written directives. So what we mean by written directives are stated policies. So you may have a policy manual for your department, and so you change some of those procedures. Maybe it's voluntary change, or again, maybe it's forced upon you because of a court case, a lawsuit. Whatever is the reason for the change, maybe we now have better equipment, and so we can do things differently, or we have better training or better knowledge about how to do things. And so these new directives and regulations may cause changes in the police. Changing strategies and tactics. So here again, I'd mentioned the example for reorganization of becoming more devoted to community policing, but this is certainly going to change the way the police uh, carry out their duties, their strategies, their tactics. If we truly, and not just in words, but also in deed, change to a community policing department, then you're more likely to have a much different style of policing on the streets, different tactics. You're getting to know the public better. You're not focusing as much on law enforcement. You're focusing on community relations and prevention of crimes, not as much on just reacting to crimes. And so adopting a community policing standard is going to change the way that you police. We saw it with when we talked about CompStat and broken windows policing in New York. Different style of policing. And if we can actually convince the officers to engage in that new style of policing, then you're going to change the way the police do their business. Changing behavior. This one can be pretty difficult because you're asking people to change the way that they make their decisions. You're asking them to change their value set. How do we achieve that? Well, probably the easiest is right from the very beginning. When the new recruits are coming in, you start working on them. Immediately in the academy, you're trying to convince them to buy into whatever value system that you have in place in your department, or that you want to have in place in your department. Maybe you've you're part of a department that's had a problematic history. They've had some scandals, they've had some corruption. And so you are brought in as a reformer, you're the new police chief, and so one of the ways that you can begin changing, and it's going to take a while, but one of the ways you can begin is with the new recruits. Implementing integrity training right from the very beginning, not just hoping that they're honest, but more importantly, giving them in the academy ethical dilemmas to work through, incentives to be honest, all these kinds of integrity training and incentives. Try those to change their behavior. For the officers who are already police officers, who are already in the department and are veteran officers, it may be more difficult to change their behavior. You can do it either through carrots or sticks. So offer them incentives to do the kinds of things that you want them to do, whether it's community policing or be honest or whatever it might be, but also have the stick that if they don't do this, there can be discipline as well. You just have to decide how to balance those two. Changing organizational culture. Your book talks about two kinds of cultures. There's occupational, which is the nature of police work generally. So it doesn't matter really what department you're in. What do the police do? Well, they respond to calls for assistance. They respond to crimes. They respond to crimes for other kinds of service. They provide general patrol, etc., etc., etc. So do we want to change the occupational culture of policing? For instance, later in the course, we're going to talk about the militarization of the police. Do we want to change that? Because American police are becoming more and more militarized. They're looking more and more like the Army than like the traditional police officer on patrol. And so, if we don't like that, the direction that the police are headed, we don't like that militarization, how do we change it overall? So that's not really necessarily looking at one single police department. That's looking at the nature of police work generally. And so when we came up with community-oriented policing, we were really trying to change the occupational culture. Okay. Now, if we want to focus on a specific department, that's really the organizational culture. So what is the culture of your police department, your hometown police department? Think about it. And what if we wanted to change that culture? Again, it's not going to be easily done, and we're going to see a couple examples in this lesson of how it was done in Madison, how it was done in Chicago, but it's not easily achieved. And so not change, as I said, the police are often very reluctant to change unless they really, really see the benefit for them, benefit to them individually or even as an organization. So we have to find ways to sell change. We have to find ways to convince the police to buy into change. Otherwise, it's going to be really difficult to accomplish it. And as you can see here, we can change organizational culture by recruiting different people, revising our training, changing the leadership as well. Your book identifies these as the three main ways to change organizational culture: different recruiting, training, leadership. And finally, let's assume that you are that new reformer who's coming into the police department to change it. What are some of the possible sources of resistance to change? Well, your book discusses inertia, and so this is borrowing from the scientific world, from the world of physics, that inertia, if you think back, and I'm sorry to cause you nightmares if physics was a nightmarish class for you, but if you think back to your high school physics class, inertia is that idea that a body in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon, and a body at rest tends to stay at rest unless acted upon. So police organizations are probably going to continue in the direction they're going unless something causes them to change. And so inertia is kind of that concept, at least as we discuss it with the police, that people tend to like doing the things they've always been doing. So we like the status quo. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, maybe it is broke and we still don't want to fix it. We still want to be going in the same direction because we like the known better than the unknown. Even though the unknown, the new change that's on the horizon could be really good for us, we're still a little scared of it, and we'd rather be doing the same old thing that we've always been doing. So this is going to be a hurdle to any kind of effort to change the police. Misunderstandings. So when you're trying to implement change, do the people affected by it, people that we call stakeholders, because they have a stake in the outcome, do the stakeholders really understand why you're trying to bring about this change? Because if they misunderstand it and they think that you're trying to cost them their jobs or make their life more miserable or whatever, they're not going to buy into it, and they're probably going to resist the change. So we're going to see, especially with Chicago, when we cover it in a couple more PowerPoints, we're going to see that they put a lot of effort into winning the hearts and minds of the police officers to convince them that change is good for them. Group norms. If you're trying to change the way that the police do their jobs, and this is really hitting at the core of some of their key values and norms, you're going to have a tough time. They're going to resist, most likely at least. They're going to dig in their heels and they're going to say, no, this is part of who we are and who we identify as. And if you're trying to change that, you're really trying to force us to become something radically different, and we don't want to. And that's where inertia also comes into play again. So when you're going against group norms, you're going to have an even tougher time. You've got to convince them that they need to change their beliefs, their value system. The balance of power. Are you upsetting the current status quo power? So is the group that's currently in power, are you really starting to infringe upon their power base and maybe even trying to upset them completely? Well, again, we would expect them to dig in and fight that change, because if they're going to lose their power, they're going to go down swinging. They're not going to just go down lightly, most likely. And so therefore, again, when you're considering how to bring about change, you've got to consider, how will this affect the balance of power? Am I now giving much more power to this other group than the traditional powerful group? If so, what's the reaction going to be?